Jin Roy was summoned to the Golden Hall. The air was thick with tension as she stepped forward, her silk robes brushing the polished stone. Before her, the emperor sat upon his jade throne, his expression unreadable. Concubine Mei Lin stood beside him, the picture of serene cruelty. Minister Jiang Wei, Duke Ren, and several noble officials were also present. This was a trial. Jin Roy bowed low. "Your Majesty." The emperor's voice was calm but deadly. "There are whispers in my court, Lady Jin Roy." Jin Roy lifted her gaze. "I would never be so bold as to question your Majesty's judgment, but I am certain that whispers are often the work of cowards." A sharp murmur ran through the hall. The emperor's lips twitched slightly. Concubine Mei Lin, however, remained unfazed. She stepped forward, her voice silken and soft. "Your Majesty, the issue is not mere whispers." She turned to Jin Roy, her eyes twinkling with false sympathy. "It has come to our attention that Lady Jin Roy has been working against the Empire's most loyal servants." Jin Roy's blood turned to ice. "I have done no such thing," she said evenly. Mei Lin tilted her head. "Are you certain?" A courtier stepped forward, holding a scroll. Jin Roy's breath caught. The scroll bore her handwriting, or at least an imitation of it. Forged. It was a false letter, implicating her in a plot to weaken the noble houses. The emperor studied the document. Jin Roy kept her expression unreadable. This was Mei Lin's move, a perfect attack. Now, she had only seconds to turn it around. Jin Roy exhaled slowly. Then, she turned to the emperor. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "May I inspect the letter?" The emperor nodded, tossing it toward her. She unrolled it, scanning the words. Then, she smiled. "Whoever wrote this," she said, "did not study my writing carefully enough." She turned, holding the letter for all to see. "Your Majesty, my personal calligraphy bears a unique flaw. I always leave a slight gap between certain strokes. This letter does not." A pause. The nobles leaned forward, murmuring. Concubine Mei Lin's eyes narrowed. Jin Roy turned to Minister Jiang Wei. "Minister Jiang is known for his keen eye. If he inspects this letter, I am certain he will find it was not written by my hand." Minister Jiang stepped forward. He took the scroll, studied it. Then, after a long silence, he spoke. "The lady speaks the truth." The tension broke like glass. Mei Lin's calm facade wavered. The emperor's gaze darkened. "Someone," he murmured, "is spreading falsehoods in my court." Jin Roy bowed deeply. "I only seek to serve the Empire, Your Majesty." The emperor exhaled, then waved a hand. "You may go." Jin Roy did not miss the way Mei Lin's hands clenched. She had survived, but now, she and Mei Lin were officially at war. That evening, Zhao Luan came to her door. His eyes burned with anger. "The Emperor has forbidden me from seeing you," he said. Jin Roy's chest tightened. "He is punishing you," she murmured. Zhao Luan stepped closer. "I do not care." Jin Roy exhaled sharply. "You should." Zhao Luan shook his head. "Jin Roy, She pressed a hand against his chest, stopping him. "We cannot afford this." A long silence. Then, Zhao Luan stepped back, but his eyes held a quiet promise. This was not over. Jin Roy had been expecting this. She had barely returned from court when a messenger arrived at her chambers, pale-faced and nervous. "The Duke requests your presence," he said. Jin Roy set down her brush, calmly smoothing her sleeves. South. It had begun. Duke Ren's private study was darker than usual. Heavy silk drapes blocked the sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of burning ink. A sign of a man who had destroyed something in anger. Jin Roy stepped inside, careful to keep her breathing even, her expression unreadable. Duke Ren stood with his back to her, gazing at a painting of an ancient battlefield. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, "You lied to me." Jin Roy did not deny it. She simply tilted her head. Lied? Or played the game as it was meant to be played? Duke Ren finally turned, his gaze sharp as a knife. "You think this is a game?" His voice was smooth, dangerous. "Do you know what I do to those who betray me?" Jin Roy's pulse quickened, but she refused to show fear. She took a step forward. "I do not fear you, my lord." A heavy silence. Then Duke Ren smirked. "You should." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "I do not like losing, Lady Jin Roy, and you have cost me much." Jin Roy lifted her chin. "Perhaps you should not have underestimated me." Duke Ren chuckled, low and cold. "I underestimated you once," he admitted. "I will not do so again." Then he leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her ear. "From now on, every move you make, I will be watching." Jin Roy held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Then watch closely, my lord," she murmured. "You may learn something." She turned and walked away. Duke Ren did not stop her, but she could feel his eyes burning into her back. This was not over. Jin Roy had just returned to her chambers when she heard the soft knock. She froze. Only a handful of people would dare come unannounced. Slowly, she walked to the door and slid it open. Her breath caught. Prince Zhao Luan stood there, dressed in dark robes, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes burning with defiance. He had come, against the Emperor's orders. Jin Roy exhaled sharply. "Are you mad?" she whispered. Zhao Luan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Probably." Jin Roy's pulse pounded. "The Emperor will—" Zhao Luan grabbed her wrist. "Enough," he said, voice low, intense. "I am tired of waiting, tired of pretending I do not care." Jin Roy's throat went dry. Zhao Luan's grip tightened slightly. "The Emperor may rule this empire, but he does not rule me." His voice softened, but his eyes remained fierce, "and I will not let him keep me from you." Jin Roy's heart was racing. This was too dangerous. "Zhao Luan," she whispered, "you will ruin yourself." Zhao Luan smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Then let me be ruined." A heavy silence. Then he let go. He took a deep breath, stepping back, giving her space. "I do not ask you to love me, Jin Roy," he said. His voice was raw, honest. "I only ask that you let me stand by your side." Jin Roy inhaled slowly. Then, at last, she spoke. "I cannot afford you, Zhao Luan." A flicker of pain flashed through his eyes. Then, he nodded once. "I understand." He turned to leave. Jin Roy's fingers twitched. She should let him go. She should. But as he reached for the door, she spoke. "But if you insist on defying the Emperor, do not be reckless." Zhao Luan paused. Slowly, he turned back. A small, victorious smirk played at his lips. "As you wish." Then he was gone. Jin Roy let out a slow, shaking breath. This was getting too dangerous. And yet, she was not sure if she wanted him to stop. Jin Roy had been waiting for Duke Ren to strike. She had known from the moment he let her walk away from his study that he would not let the betrayal go unanswered. So when whispers spread through the court that she had grown too close to Prince Zhao Luan, that she had ensnared him in her ambitions, she knew exactly where they had come from. Duke Ren had crafted a trap. If the Emperor believed she was manipulating his son, she would be exiled, or worse. But Duke Ren had underestimated her again. The next morning, Jin Roy was summoned before the Emperor. She walked into the grand hall, composed, controlled, unreadable. Duke Ren stood to one side, his expression calm but expectant. Concubine Mei Lin was present as well, her serene smile hiding a dagger. The emperor sat on his jade throne, watching her with a gaze as sharp as a blade. "The court tells me you have ensnared my son," the emperor said, voice dangerously low. Jin Roy bowed deeply. "Your Majesty, I serve only the empire, not my own desires." Duke Ren smirked slightly. "And yet, the second prince openly defies your Majesty for this woman." A murmur rippled through the nobles. Jin Roy turned toward Duke Ren slowly. She did not blink, did not waver. "The Duke flatters me," she said smoothly, "but it is not I who holds influence over the prince. It is your Majesty." The emperor raised an eyebrow. Duke Ren's smirk faltered. Jin Roy turned back to the emperor. "If your Majesty's will is absolute, then it is not I who has failed to control Prince Zhao Luan. It is those who advise you." A tense silence. Duke Ren's jaw clenched. Jin Roy continued, "If I have truly ensnared him, then why has he not abandoned his duty? Why has he not declared rebellion? He serves your Majesty, as do I." She bowed once more. "I am but a loyal servant of the empire." The emperor's gaze lingered on her. Then he laughed, low, dark, amused. "You are a clever one," he murmured. "Too clever." He glanced at Duke Ren. "This is the best you could offer me? Petty rumors?" Duke Ren's expression remained neutral, but Jin Roy saw it. The tightening of his fingers, the brief flicker of defeat. Jin Roy had won, but Duke Ren was not done with her yet. Jin Roy had barely left the throne room when a servant intercepted her. "The noble concubine requests your presence." Jin Roy's lips curled slightly. South Mei Lin was ready to make her move. The Orchid Pavilion was Mei Lin's domain. When Jin Roy entered, the concubine was seated gracefully on a silk divan, sipping plum wine. Her expression was calm, unreadable. "You have survived," Mei Lin said lightly. Jin Roy bowed. "For now." Mei Lin smiled. "And yet, I wonder how long you can continue dancing so elegantly in a court filled with wolves." Jin Roy stepped forward, her voice smooth, unwavering. "Perhaps the wolves should ask themselves the same question." A brief silence. Then, Mei Lin laughed softly. She leaned forward, eyes glittering. "You are bold. I admire that." She poured a second cup of wine. Then, with deliberate grace, she offered it to Jin Roy. A test, a challenge, a silent message. "Drink and acknowledge my power." Jin Roy accepted the cup. She lifted it slowly, then tilted her wrist, letting the wine spill onto the floor. A delicate, silent rejection. Mei Lin's smile never wavered, but Jin Roy saw the promise of war in her eyes. This was not over. Jin Roy had expected retaliation, but not this. The entire court had gathered for the announcement. The emperor sat upon his throne, his expression calm and authoritative. "Prince Zhao Luan will marry the daughter of the chancellor," he declared. Gasps, whispers. Jin Roy felt her stomach drop. Zhao Luan stood rigidly, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. His father's gaze did not waver. "You have defied me once," the emperor continued. "You will not do so again." Jin Roy's heart pounded. Zhao Luan's eyes flicked to her. For the first time, there was desperation in them. But he said nothing, because there was nothing to say. The emperor's will was absolute. Jin Roy inhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain still, silent, unreadable. This was not her battle to fight. She had known from the beginning that there was no future for them. And yet, why did this feel like a loss? Jin Roy knew he would come. She had felt it in the way Zhao Luan had looked at her during the announcement, a storm barely held in check. So when she heard the sharp knock on her door late that night, she wasn't surprised. Slowly, she walked to the entrance, sliding it open. Zhao Luan stood there, his breath uneven, his hands clenched. Angry, desperate. Without a word, he stepped inside and shut the door behind him. A long silence. Then, "Tell me you don't care." Jin Rui's heart stilled. Zhao Luan's voice was raw, frustrated. "Tell me you don't care, and I will leave," he said, stepping closer. "Tell me, and I will obey my father. I will marry her. I will forget this." Jin Rui inhaled sharply, forcing herself to keep her expression unreadable. "You already know my answer," she whispered. Zhao Luan shook his head, exhaling sharply. "No," he said. "You have spent your entire life surviving, Jin Rui. When will you fight for something?" Jin Rui's breath hitched. He took her hands, gripping them tightly. "Fight for me." Jin Rui felt her heart twisting. She had never allowed herself to dream, but standing here, in the quiet of the night, with the man she could not have looking at her, as if she was the only thing that mattered, she wanted. For the first time in years, she truly wanted. And it terrified her. She swallowed, gently pulling her hands away. "I will find a way," she whispered. Zhao Luan's shoulders tensed. "Jin Rui." "I will find a way," she repeated, firmer now. His breath shook. Then, after a long moment, he nodded. His voice was quiet, but certain. "I will wait." Then he was gone. Jin Rui let out a slow, unsteady breath. She had made her choice. Now she had to find a way to win. Mei Lin sipped her plum wine, her expression unreadable. Across from her, Duke Ren leaned back against his chair, his fingers tapping against the lacquered wood. "She is becoming a problem," Mei Lin murmured. Duke Ren chuckled. "I warned you." Mei Lin's smile did not reach her eyes. "She humiliated you," she said, tilting her head. "And yet, you still play these little games with her." Duke Ren's gaze darkened. "Jin Rui is useful, but not if she becomes uncontrollable." Mei Lin ran a delicate finger along the rim of her cup. "Then we will make her disposable." Duke Ren raised an eyebrow. "You have a plan." Mei Lin's smile turned sharper. "There is only one crime the Emperor does not forgive." Duke Ren's lips curled. "Treason." Mei Lin tilted her cup slightly, letting a drop of wine spill onto the silk tablecloth. "Let us see if she can escape this." Jin Rui knew something was wrong the moment she stepped into court. The air was too still. The nobles were too quiet. Then, the accusation came. A minister stepped forward, holding a sealed letter. A letter written in her handwriting. Or at least, a forgery of it. "The court has uncovered a treasonous letter," the minister declared, his voice ringing through the hall. Gasps. Jin Rui's blood ran cold. The emperor's gaze sharpened. "This letter," the minister continued, "suggests that Lady Jin Rui has been working to weaken the empire's trade routes for her own gain." Jin Rui's mind raced. This was Duke Ren's doing, and Mei Lin's. She had expected retaliation, but not this soon. She needed to act. Now Jin Rui stepped forward calmly. "I would like to examine this letter, Your Majesty." The emperor nodded. She took the letter, carefully unrolling it. Then she smiled. "You are all mistaken," she said smoothly. The court stilled. Jin Rui turned toward the ministers. "This letter is not treasonous." The minister sputtered. Jin Rui held up a hand. "This letter does not suggest I was weakening the empire. It was a strategy proposal, one that I discussed in an earlier session." She turned to Minister Jiang Wei, the emperor's strategist. Minister Jiang, you will remember I suggested alternative trade routes to prevent noble monopolization. This letter merely reflects that discussion. Hardly treason, don't you think? Minister Jiang stepped forward, taking the letter. He studied it. Then, after a long silence, he looked up at the emperor. She speaks the truth. A murmur spread through the court. Mei Lin's expression remained calm, but Jin Roy saw the faint flicker of tension in her shoulders. Duke Ren's gaze was unreadable. The emperor leaned back in his throne. A mistake then, he murmured. Then, he looked directly at Mei Lin. I do not like mistakes. A warning, a dismissal. Jin Roy had won. For now. Jin Roy knew there was only one man in the court who could change the emperor's mind. Jin Roy had learned long ago that everything in the imperial court had a price, and if she wanted Minister Jiang's help, she would have to pay it. She met him beneath the willow trees of the emperor's private gardens, where few dared to go. The strategist was seated on a stone bench, sipping a delicate cup of tea, as if he had been expecting her. You have a request, he murmured without looking up. Jin Roy did not waste time. I need you to stop the emperor's command, she said, her voice calm but firm. Jiang Wei finally lifted his gaze. His dark eyes gleamed with amusement. Ah, you wish to stop the wedding? Jin Roy nodded. Jiang Wei tilted his head. And what will you give me in return? Jin Roy had already anticipated this. She lowered her voice. I know that Duke Ren and concubine Mei Lin are working together. Jiang Wei's brows lifted slightly. She continued, I can be your informant. Your eyes in the shadows. A heavy silence. Then, Jiang Wei chuckled. He set down his cup. You intrigue me, Lady Jin Roy. He stood, stepping closer. Very well. Jin Roy inhaled slowly. You will help me? Jiang Wei's smirk deepened. I will give you an opportunity, he murmured. Whether or not you succeed depends on you. 2 days later, during the emperor's morning court, Minister Jiang spoke. Your Majesty, he said, his tone casual, as if the matter was of little concern. Regarding the second prince's impending marriage, the emperor's expression did not change. Speak. Jiang Wei inclined his head. It is, of course, a wise decision. A union with the chancellor's family will strengthen the empire. A murmur of agreement spread through the nobles. Jiang Wei let it settle, then made his move. However, he continued, there have been concerns that forcing such a match upon His Highness might weaken the people's trust in his leadership. The emperor's gaze flickered. Jiang Wei continued smoothly. It would be unseemly, perhaps, for the people to believe their prince is bound not by choice, but by force. A beat of silence. Then, the emperor chuckled. A low, amused sound. He looked to Zhao Luan, seated among the other princes. Tell me, my son, do you wish to marry the chancellor's daughter? All eyes turned to Zhao Luan. The prince straightened. Jin Roy held her breath. If Zhao Luan said yes, all of this would be for nothing. But if he said no? Zhao Luan stood, and then, with unwavering certainty, he bowed deeply. I live to serve your Majesty, he said, but my heart is loyal elsewhere. A collective gasp. Jin Roy's fingers tightened in her sleeves. Zhao Luan had just done something unforgivable, and now she had to act. The court erupted in whispers. Zhao Luan's words could not be ignored. The emperor's expression darkened. This is a dangerous declaration, my son, he said. To whom does your heart belong? Zhao Luan did not hesitate. He turned, his eyes locking onto Jin Roy. A deadly silence. Jin Roy's heart pounded. She knew what she had to do. She stepped forward. She knelt before the emperor, her voice steady. Your Majesty, she said, if it pleases you, I wish to present an alternative path. The emperor raised an eyebrow. An alternative? Jin Roy lifted her chin. A marriage should serve the empire, she said, but this one does not. More murmurs. Jin Roy continued. A forced union will only create resentment. If His Highness is to be wed, let it be by a test of merit, not obligation. The emperor's gaze pierced through her. A test? Jin Roy took a deep breath. The imperial selection, she said. A ripple of shock ran through the room. Jin Roy kept her expression composed. The nobility has always chosen their matches for power, she said. But what if the match was earned instead? She lowered her voice. Let it be a trial, a contest of intellect, strategy, and skill. The woman who proves herself worthy shall stand beside him. Silence. The emperor studied her. Then he laughed. A deep, rich, amused laugh. You are clever, he murmured. He glanced at Zhao Luan. And you, my son? Zhao Luan met his father's gaze without hesitation. I accept the trial, he said, and I will accept no bride who does not earn her place beside me. A long silence. Then, the emperor nodded. So be it. The court erupted into chaos. That night, as the moon hung high, Jin Roy stood alone in the garden. Zhao Luan found her there. He approached silently, carefully. She did not turn. I gave you a chance, he murmured. Jin Roy closed her eyes. You gave me a battle. He chuckled softly. Would you rather I had let them take me from you? Jin Roy turned to face him. I would rather have had a choice, she whispered. Zhao Luan tilted his head. Then win, he murmured, and take that choice for yourself. Jin Roy exhaled. The battle was far from over, but now she had a chance to fight. The golden courtyard was filled with the most powerful noble families in the empire. The emperor sat on his jade throne, watching with mild amusement as the assembled noblewomen stood in neat rows, dressed in silks embroidered with symbols of their houses. Jin Roy stood among them, but unlike the others, she did not belong to any great house. She was an outsider, a threat, a woman who should not have been here at all. And yet, she was. Minister Zhang Wei stepped forward, unrolling a silk scroll. The imperial selection will test each candidate's wisdom, strength, and loyalty, he announced. Only the most worthy will advance. He paused. Then his lips curved slightly as he added, Let there be no weakness in this contest. A future empress must be prepared for anything. The meaning was clear. This would not be a polite game of etiquette. This was a battle, and Jin Roy intended to win. The first trial was held in the Hall of Scholars, a vast chamber lined with scrolls and ancient tomes. The candidates were given a single sheet of paper and a problem to solve. The problem? A hypothetical rebellion in the western provinces. Each candidate had to write a strategy to suppress the rebellion without unnecessary bloodshed. Jin Roy scanned the room. Among her strongest rivals were Lady Shu Qing, a noblewoman from one of the wealthiest merchant families, known for her sharp mind and political cunning. General's daughter, Lin Yao, a trained warrior who also studied military strategy, fiercely competitive. Princess Zhao Ying, a skilled manipulator, she had no intention of losing. Jin Roy took a deep breath. She had been preparing for battles of the mind her entire life. Her hand moved swiftly over the parchment. She outlined a strategy that balanced military suppression with diplomatic outreach, crushing the rebellion's leadership while simultaneously gaining the people's loyalty. By the time the challenge ended, she knew her plan was superior. And when the emperor read her answer aloud before the court, nodding in approval, she knew the others knew it too. The second challenge was a physical test, a trial of endurance, precision, and strength. Jin Roy had anticipated an attack, and yet, Even she was surprised by how crude and desperate Duke Ren and Mei Lin's sabotage attempt was. The candidates were led to the Imperial training grounds, where they were to hit a moving target with a bow. Jin Roy was given a faulty bowstring, one that would snap the moment she pulled it back. She noticed immediately. She turned the bow in her hands, feeling the tension. Then she smiled. If they wanted to cheat, then she would teach them a lesson. She raised the bow, pretending not to notice the flaw. She aimed, and just as the bowstring snapped, she let the arrow fly. Off course, straight toward Princess Zhao Ying's target. A perfect bullseye. The court gasped. Jin Roy turned, feigning surprise. She immediately lowered the bow, bowing respectfully toward the Emperor. "Apologies, Your Majesty," she said smoothly. "It seems my equipment was unfit for the test." The Emperor's gaze darkened. He turned to the Master of Arms. "Explain this." The bow was inspected, and when the truth was revealed, Duke Ren and Mei Lin's attempt to sabotage her was painfully obvious. The Emperor sighed in irritation. "Replace her equipment," he ordered. "She will retake the test." Jin Roy smirked as she accepted a new bow. When she shot her real arrow, it landed exactly where she intended. Bullseye. Duke Ren said nothing. Mei Lin's lips thinned. They had failed. Again. Zhao Luan had been watching the entire selection in silence. But when Jin Roy's bow snapped, something in him snapped as well. He stepped forward, his hands clenched. A movement too quick, too sharp. Minister Zhang immediately caught his sleeve, holding him back. "Do not be foolish," Jiang Wei murmured. "She does not need you to save her." Zhao Luan gritted his teeth. But then, he saw Jin Roy smirk, saw how she had already adapted, already planned ahead. He forced himself to exhale, to trust her, and so he stepped back. He would not be the one to ruin her victory. Later that evening, Jin Roy stood alone in the moonlit courtyard. She was exhausted, but victorious. She heard footsteps. She knew who it was before he spoke. Zhao Luan stood behind her, silent for a long moment. Then, at last, he said, "You were incredible." Jin Roy smiled faintly. "Did you doubt me?" Zhao Luan chuckled softly. "Never." He hesitated, then said, "I almost interfered." Jin Roy turned to face him. "But you didn't." A long silence. Zhao Luan's eyes softened. "Number I didn't." Jin Roy took a slow breath. "Then keep trusting me,"